The storm struck without warning, turning the mountain road into a white graveyard of wind and ice. At the gates of a silent castle, a mother dog curled around her pup, choosing freezing death over abandonment. Her breath was fading when a Navy SEAL slowed his truck and saw something that made him stop cold. He had sworn never to take in another life. Yet this time, he opened the door and lifted them inside. One decision that could change the course of his life forever. What followed revealed cruelty, courage, and a kind of faith that needs no uniform. Where are you watching from? And would you have stopped? Like, subscribe, and tell us below. The road into the northern hills narrowed as dusk crept in, the kind of quiet hour where sound softened and the world seemed to hold its breath. Nate Kincaid drove alone, as he always did, his pickup moving steadily along the frozen ribbon of asphalt that cut through pine and stone. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had once lived by orders and learned to survive without them. He was tall, just over 6 feet, broad in the shoulders, built not like a bodybuilder but like someone who trained because it kept the ghosts at bay. His face was clean-shaven, angular, the kind that looked carved rather than born, with a strong jaw and cheekbones sharpened by years of wind and worry. His hair, dark brown and clipped into a neat undercut, was always kept clean, practical. His eyes, blue-gray, steady, and distant, rarely betrayed what he was thinking. People in town said he looked calm. Those who knew better understood that calm was something he worked hard to maintain. Nate lived alone in a small timber cabin perched above the valley, far enough from town that silence still meant something. He didn't keep pets, didn't grow plants, didn't collect memories. Everything in his life had a purpose and an expiration date. He'd learned that lesson overseas, in heat and dust and noise, where attachment had a way of turning into regret. When he came home from the teams, he built a life that required nothing of him beyond routine. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. It was a way to stay standing without asking too many questions. That evening, the sky carried a color that made him uneasy. Too pale, too still. Snow was coming, not the gentle kind, but the heavy northern kind that swallowed roads and rewrote maps. He'd checked the forecast twice before leaving town, but mountains had a habit of ignoring predictions. As he rounded the long bend near the old Wycliffe estate, the temperature dropped another degree, and the wind began to push sideways across the road. The castle-like house loomed on the ridge to his right, all stone and iron, its windows dark despite the early hour. The Wycliffes had money older than the town itself, and a reputation for keeping to themselves. Nate had never spoken to any of them. He preferred it that way. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow trapped in the snow, something the wind had shaped and forgotten. He slowed instinctively. The headlights caught movement, a shudder, barely visible. Nate eased the truck to a stop just past the iron gate, his hands tightening on the wheel. For a moment, he stayed where he was, engine idling, heater humming. He had learned long ago that not everything you saw on the roadside was your responsibility. Sometimes survival meant knowing when to keep moving, but then the shape shifted again. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against ice. The wind cut through his jacket instantly, sharp and unforgiving. A few feet from the gate, half buried in snow, lay a German shepherd. Her coat, once black and tan, was stiff with frost, her body curled tightly around a small white shape beneath her chest. As Nate approached, he saw it clearly. A puppy, no more than 8 weeks old, barely breathing, its tiny sides fluttering weakly beneath a crust of ice. The mother didn't growl. She didn't run. She lifted her head just enough to look at him, amber eyes clouded with exhaustion, but still alert, still fighting. Nate stopped cold. He'd seen that look before, on men who knew they were losing but refused to surrender. His chest tightened in a way he didn't like. He crouched slowly, hands open, breath visible in the air. The dog didn't bare her teeth. She simply shifted her weight, shielding the pup with what little warmth she had left. The puppy made a faint sound, not quite a cry, more like a question the world had forgotten to answer. He told himself to walk away. He told himself there were shelters, authorities, people better suited for this. He told himself he didn't do attachments anymore. But the truth pressed in harder than the cold. If he left now, the puppy would not last another hour. And the mother, she already knew that. That was the moment he felt it. Not fear, not pity. Something older. A pull he hadn't felt since the day he'd carried a wounded teammate through smoke and fire, knowing in his bones that stopping meant death. He exhaled slowly, as if surrendering to something inevitable, and opened the truck door. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness. Carefully, he shrugged off his outer jacket and laid it on the snow, inching it toward them. The dog watched every movement, muscles trembling, but she didn't snap. When he lifted the puppy first, light as breath, frighteningly cold, her body tensed, then relaxed just enough to allow it. He wrapped the little one against his chest, feeling the faintest pulse of life, then returned for the mother. She tried to stand and failed, legs buckling beneath her. He slid an arm beneath her chest, another beneath her hindquarters, and lifted. She was lighter than she should have been. As he carried them to the truck, a strange thought crossed his mind, uninvited and unwelcome. You're doing this again. The cab filled with the scent of wet fur and snow. He cranked the heat, wrapped both dogs in spare blankets, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel, breathing hard. The wind howled outside, rattling the metal gate of the estate behind him. For just a second, he thought he saw movement near the house, someone watching. But when he looked again, there was only shadow. He drove the rest of the way home in silence, eyes fixed on the road, jaw set. The cabin lights cut through the dark as he pulled in, the familiar outline of his home standing against the white. Inside, he laid the dogs near the fireplace, building the fire higher than usual, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. The puppy whimpered softly. The mother shifted, placing herself between Nate and the little one, even as exhaustion pulled her under. He sat back on his heels, studying them, something heavy settling in his chest. He hadn't planned this, hadn't wanted it. And yet, as the fire crackled and the storm pressed in around the cabin, he realized the truth he'd spent years avoiding. Some things don't ask for permission. Rehook. As Nate reached for a towel, the mother dog stirred suddenly, lifting her head with a low, urgent sound. Her ears flattened, her gaze locked on the window, not at the snow, but beyond it. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upright and let out a warning growl, weak but unmistakable. Nate followed her stare. Outside, at the edge of the tree line, something moved, just long enough for the headlights to catch the reflection of glass or metal before it vanished again into the storm. For the first time since stopping his truck, Nate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Whatever had left that dog to die in the snow might not be finished yet. He turned back to the fire, to the trembling animals depending on him now, and made a decision he hadn't made in years. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. The storm howled louder, pressing against the walls of the cabin as if testing the choice he'd just made. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and cold metal when Nate carried them inside. Snow clung to his boots, melting in slow puddles on the floor as he set the dogs down near the hearth. He moved with the same precision he had learned years ago, controlled, deliberate, efficient. But there was something else now, something unsteady beneath the surface. The fire crackled as he fed it another log, flames licking upward as warmth slowly returned to the room. He had nothing prepared for this. No bowls, no blankets meant for animals, no plan. So he improvised. An old flannel shirt became a wrap. A faded towel became a bed. He warmed a small pot of milk on the stove, careful not to let it scald, testing the temperature the way he used to test water for injured men in the field. The puppy, white, impossibly small, barely stirred as he lifted it, its body frighteningly light in his hands. He fed it slowly, drop by drop, watching the fragile rise and fall of its chest like a countdown clock. He didn't want to reach 0. The mother dog never took her eyes off him. She lay curled tightly around the pup whenever he set it down, her body forming a barrier between him and the only thing she had left. Her coat was thick but dull, clumped in places where ice had frozen it solid. One ear bore a slight tear, old and healed wrong. Her eyes, amber, alert despite exhaustion, tracked every movement he made, measuring him, judging him. "She's not afraid of me," Nate muttered under his breath. "She's afraid for you." The words surprised him. He wasn't used to talking aloud, especially not to animals. But the cabin had a way of making silence feel heavier than sound. He sat back against the wall, boots still on, arms resting on his knees. The fire painted long shadows across the room, catching the hard lines of his face, the clean-shaven jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the eyes that carried too many winters. He hadn't meant to stay up. He hadn't meant to watch them sleep. But when the puppy's breathing stuttered and steadied again, something inside him clenched. He closed his eyes, and the memory came anyway. A different cold, a different night. A man bleeding out in his arms while rotors thundered overhead. Nate's hands had been soaked then, too, warm, red, useless. He remembered the weight of that body, the sound of breath failing, the moment he'd realized he was out of time. He had told himself afterward that survival was luck, not choice, that you couldn't carry every life back with you. That was the day he stopped letting himself care. The fire popped, snapping him back to the present. The puppy shifted, letting out a weak sound. The mother lifted her head instantly, nose touching the pup's side, checking. Nate watched the motion, the instinctive tenderness, and felt something inside him loosen just enough to hurt. He slept in the chair that night, boots still on, waking every hour to check their breathing. By morning, the storm had thickened, snow burying the windows until the world outside looked erased. The puppy was worse. Its breathing came in shallow pulls, its body limp despite the warmth. The mother nudged it, whining softly now, no longer trying to hide her fear. Nate didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed his jacket, wrapped the pup tight against his chest, and carried both dogs to the truck. The road to the nearest veterinary clinic was nearly an hour away on a good day. In a storm like this, it felt endless. The windshield wipers fought the snow in frantic arcs. Nate's jaw tightened as he drove, one hand on the wheel, the other braced against the carrier he'd fashioned from a storage crate. The mother lay beside the pup, eyes never leaving it, as if her stare alone might keep it alive. The clinic lights cut through the white like a beacon. Dr. Hazel Morrow met him at the door before he could knock. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with chestnut hair pulled into a messy knot and sleeves already rolled up. Her face carried the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen too much suffering to waste time on panic. A thin scar ran along her forearm, old, pale, the kind you stopped noticing after a while. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the puppy. "Found them in the snow," Nate said. "Near the Wycliffe place." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the name, but she said nothing as she ushered them inside. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Machines hummed. Lights flickered slightly as the storm strained the power lines. Hazel worked quickly, checking temperature, listening to lungs, palpating limbs. Nate stood back, arms crossed, trying not to interfere. The mother paced, restless but compliant, eyes flicking between the vet and her pup. "Hypothermia," Hazel said quietly. "Severe. Early-stage pneumonia, too, if you'd found him an hour later." She didn't finish the sentence. Then she paused, fingers brushing the fur around the pup's neck. Her expression changed, subtle but unmistakable. "These marks," she said. "See this? Rope burn. And here, pressure bruising. He wasn't just out in the cold." Nate felt something settle in his chest, heavy and cold. "You're saying someone did this?" "I'm saying he didn't wander off," Hazel replied. And neither did she. The mother let out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, something in between. Hazel glanced at her, then back at Nate. "I've seen this before. Dogs tied up, punished, left when they become inconvenient." Nate nodded slowly, jaw clenched. The words hit harder than he expected. It wasn't just cruelty. It was intention. Hazel stabilized the puppy and turned to him. "He'll live. But he needs warmth, antibiotics, rest. And so does she." Nate didn't hesitate. "I'll handle it." Hazel studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I thought you might." They stepped outside together, snow falling thick around them. As Nate loaded the dogs back into his truck, Hazel spoke again, quieter this time. "You should know, dogs like this don't end up out there by accident. Someone wanted them gone." Nate met her gaze. "Then someone's going to have to answer for that." He drove back up the mountain with the storm at his heels, the weight of her words settling in his bones. Rehook. Halfway up the road, the mother dog suddenly sat up, stiff and alert, her gaze locked on the tree line. A low rumble vibrated in her chest, not fear, but recognition. Nate slowed instinctively. For just a moment, his headlights caught the reflection of something metallic deeper in the woods. Not eyes, not snow. Something still, watching. The mother growled once, sharp, deliberate, and pressed closer to her pup. Nate's grip tightened on the wheel. Whatever had left them in the storm wasn't finished. When he finally reached the cabin, he carried them inside without another thought. The fire was still burning, the room warm, but the air felt different now, charged, uneasy. As he settled them near the hearth, he realized the truth he'd been avoiding since the road. This wasn't just rescue. It was the beginning of something he couldn't walk away from. And somewhere beyond the trees, someone knew it. The storm loosened its grip some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt staged. Nate stood at the cabin window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the first pale light slide across the drifts. The world looked clean again, too clean. Snow had a way of hiding things, footprints, blood, intentions. But Nate had learned long ago that nothing truly disappeared. It only waited to be noticed. Behind him, the cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the shallow breathing of the two dogs near the hearth. The puppy, Ghost, slept wrapped in a blanket, his small body rising and falling more evenly than the night before. Freya lay curled protectively around him, eyes half-lidded but alert. She hadn't slept much. Neither had Nate. He hadn't gone back to bed after returning from the clinic. Instead, he'd sat in the chair by the fire, listening to the wind and replaying Hazel's words over and over. He didn't wander off. That thought followed him now as he pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The cold bit immediately, sharp and clean. The sky was pale blue, the kind that came only after heavy snowfall. Nate scanned the area around the cabin, his eyes instinctively tracing lines most people wouldn't notice, where snow had drifted unnaturally, where branches were bent, where something heavy had passed through. He found it near the edge of the tree line. A set of tire tracks, partially filled in by snow, but still visible if you knew how to look. Not from last night. Older. The tread pattern wasn't common around here. Too clean, too deliberate. He crouched, running a gloved hand along the frozen groove, his jaw tightening. Someone had been here before him. Back inside, Freya lifted her head as he entered, watching him with that steady, knowing gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now, only expectation. She knew something he didn't. Or maybe she'd always known, and he was just catching up. That was when he noticed the other tracks. Paw prints, larger than Freya's, leading toward the tree line and stopping just short of the cabin. They were recent. Very recent. Nate straightened slowly. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what you're hiding." He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside again, following the prints into the woods. The forest was quiet in the way that made trained men uneasy. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of his boots and the faint creak of frozen branches. He saw the dog before it saw him. A German shepherd stood between two pines, half-shadowed, watching him with a stillness that felt intentional. The animal was large, powerfully built, its coat a deep black and tan, thick with winter underfur. Its ears were upright, alert. One front paw hovered slightly off the ground, not injured, just poised. Its eyes, amber, sharp, never left his. It didn't growl. It didn't approach. It simply watched. Nate stopped a few yards away, hands loose at his sides. Years of training told him this wasn't a stray. Strays didn't hold themselves like this. This dog had discipline, awareness, purpose. "You're not lost," Nate said quietly. The dog's ears twitched. It took one slow step forward, then another, testing him. Its gaze flicked briefly to Nate's jacket, specifically the sleeve he'd worn the night before. Then it froze. The dog lowered its head and sniffed the air, body going tense. A low sound rolled from its chest, not aggressive, but warning. Nate followed its gaze to his coat, still carrying the faint scent of blood, antiseptic, and cold fur. Understanding settled in. "You know them," he said. The dog didn't deny it. Instead, it turned and moved deeper into the trees, stopping after a few paces to look back at him. Waiting. Nate hesitated only a second before following. They moved through the forest in silence, the dog leading with certainty. It didn't rush. It didn't stray. It knew exactly where it was going. Nate felt something stir in his chest, a recognition he hadn't felt in years. This was how patrols worked. 1-point man, one follower. Trust built on motion, not words. They reached the edge of a clearing behind the Wycliffe estate. The mansion loomed ahead, stone walls rising from the snow like something ancient and indifferent. Behind it, partially hidden by trees, was a patch of ground where the snow looked wrong, disturbed, uneven. The dog stopped. Nate approached slowly and knelt. What he found made his stomach tighten. A length of rope, stiff with frost. A broken collar, the leather torn, metal clasp bent as if ripped free. The smell hit him next, sharp, chemical, unmistakable beneath the cold. Bleach, and something else. Blood. Not much. Enough. He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on him. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't accident. This was intent. As Nate reached for the collar, the dog suddenly stiffened and backed away, hackles raised. Its eyes fixed on the house above them. A light flickered briefly behind one of the upper windows. Just once, then gone. The dog let out a low, warning growl that vibrated through the quiet. Not fear. Recognition. Someone had been watching them. Nate stood slowly, every sense sharpened. He didn't move toward the house. Not yet. He didn't need to. He already knew enough. The dog turned away from the estate and trotted back toward the trees, stopping once to make sure he followed. When they reached the edge of the clearing again, the animal paused, studying him one last time. Up close, Nate could see the signs clearly now. Old scars beneath the fur, the faint stiffness in one leg, the way the dog's eyes tracked every movement with trained precision. "You're not a stray," Nate said softly. "You're a survivor." The dog held his gaze for a long moment, then did something unexpected. It sat, not in submission, indecision. Nate exhaled slowly, a strange warmth spreading through his chest despite the cold. He reached out, palm open, stopping short of touching. The dog leaned forward just enough for its nose to brush his fingers. That was all it took. When Nate returned to the cabin, the dog followed at a distance, silent as a shadow. Freya lifted her head as they entered, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before softening. The newcomer lowered his head respectfully. There was no challenge, only recognition. Nate closed the door behind them and rested his forehead against the wood for a moment. 3 dogs now, 3 lives tied to a trail that led straight back to the same place. And for the first time since he'd come home from war, Nate understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't coincidence. This was a line someone had crossed, and he was standing exactly where it ended. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, the kind that didn't ask permission. Nate was in the kitchen rinsing a bowl when Freya lifted her head, ears angling forward. Coda, who had been lying near the door as if he'd always belonged there, rose in one smooth motion and stood still, muscles tight. Ghost stirred in his sleep and whimpered softly. Nate dried his hands slowly. He already knew who it was. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in first, followed by a man who looked like Winter had learned how to wear a suit. Elliot Wycliffe stood on the porch with practiced ease, tall and lean, his posture erect in a way that suggested wealth without effort. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and a face carved sharp by discipline rather than age. His coat was dark wool, tailored perfectly, the kind of garment that never touched mud. Pale gloves covered his hands, and when he removed them, his fingers were long and unscarred. Not a man accustomed to labor. His eyes, however, were the unsettling part, cold blue, calm, the kind that measured value quickly and discarded what didn't serve it. "Mr. Kincaid," Elliot said, voice smooth, almost pleasant. "I trust I'm not intruding." Nate didn't step aside. "Depends what you want." Elliot's gaze flicked past him, just once, toward the interior of the cabin. The fire, the dogs. He saw them. Of course he did. "You've taken something that belongs to me," Elliot said evenly. "I'm here to retrieve it." Behind Nate, Freya stiffened. Coda took one silent step forward, positioning himself between the stranger and the rest of the room. Nate's voice remained level. "You should choose your words carefully." A faint smile tugged at Elliot's mouth. "Very well. The German shepherd, the female and her pup. They were part of my household. Valuable animals. I'd like them returned." There it was. Not concern, not relief, ownership. Nate leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance completely. They were half dead in the snow. "Accidents happen," Elliot replied smoothly. "Animals wander, storms come unexpectedly." "They were tied, Nate said. Silence followed, thin and brittle. Elliot's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Then the mask returned. "I'm afraid you're mistaken." Nate studied him, really studied him now. The immaculate coat, the calm breathing, the faint irritation that crept into the corners of his eyes when things didn't go as planned. This was a man who had spent his life giving orders and rarely hearing no. "You left them to die," Nate said. The smile disappeared. "Be careful," Elliot replied softly. "You're making assumptions about a situation you don't understand." Behind them, Coda let out a low growl, barely audible but filled with intent. Elliot's gaze snapped to the dog. Something flickered there, recognition perhaps, or annoyance. "That one's not mine," Elliot said, "but I recognize training when I see it." Nate felt the air shift. The temperature hadn't changed, but the room felt tighter now, smaller. "You're not taking them," Nate said. Elliot's expression hardened. You're a former soldier living alone in the woods. No witnesses, no paperwork. You really want to challenge my word against yours?" Nate met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not challenging you. I'm telling you no." The silence stretched. Then Elliot smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Very well," he said calmly. "I'll let the authorities handle it. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant." He turned, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, and Mr. Kincaid?" Nate didn't respond. "Animals can't testify," Elliot added lightly, "and neither can ghosts." The door closed behind him with a soft click. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Freya exhaled shakily and lay down beside Ghost, pressing her body protectively against him. Coda remained standing, eyes locked on the door, long after the man had gone. Nate felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He had crossed a line, and he knew exactly what came next. That evening, as the light faded and snow began falling again, Coda suddenly bolted upright, hackles raised. He went to the window and growled, low, sharp, unmistakably alarmed. Nate followed his gaze and saw something that made his pulse spike. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a pair of headlights blinked off. Someone had been watching the house. The night passed without further incident, but sleep never truly came. Nate sat in the chair by the fire, rifle resting against the wall nearby, listening to the steady breathing of the dogs. He didn't regret his choice, but he understood the cost now. Morning came with gray light and silence. No tracks, no sign of the car, just fresh snow covering everything, as if the world had decided to pretend nothing had happened. Nate made coffee and stood at the window, watching the forest. This wasn't over. He could feel it. And somewhere deep in his gut, beneath the training and the years of restraint, something old stirred awake. Not anger, not fear, purpose. The snow had stopped again, but the air felt heavier than before. Not with weather, with consequence. Nate stood at the kitchen table, hands braced against the wood, watching Hazel organize papers into neat stacks. She moved with practiced calm, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair pulled into a low bun that revealed the faint scar running from her jawline to her ear. Hazel Markham was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Years of working in remote clinics had etched quiet authority into her posture. She had seen too many animals come in too late, too many excuses dressed up as accidents. "These records are enough to raise flags," she said, tapping the top page with her pen. "But not enough to force a seizure." Nate exhaled slowly. "What's missing?" "Intent," Hazel replied. "And a pattern." Freya lay on a blanket near the fire, her breathing shallow but steady. The scar along her side, half hidden by fur, twitched faintly with each breath. Ghost was curled against her chest, small and warm, his ears twitching whenever Nate moved. Coda sat near the door, watchful as ever, amber eyes tracking every sound outside. Hazel glanced at the dogs, her expression softening. "She's been hurt before," she said quietly. "Not just neglected, restrained, starved. This wasn't a one-time thing." Nate nodded. He already knew. They heard the truck before they saw it. Gravel crunched slowly outside, deliberate, not rushed, not lost. A moment later, a knock. 3 firm taps. Nate opened the door to find Sheriff Thomas Barlow standing on the porch. Barlow was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, but beginning to soften with age, his brown uniform pulled tight across a thick chest. His mustache was neatly trimmed, his gray hair combed back with care. He looked like a man who had once been decisive, and now spent most of his time navigating compromise. Behind him, his cruiser idled. "Afternoon, Nate," Barlow said, eyes already drifting past him into the cabin. "Heard you had an incident." "Depends who you heard it from." Barlow sighed and stepped inside, removing his hat. His gaze fell on Freya, then Ghost, then Coda. Something flickered across his face. recognition, maybe guilt. "Elliot Wycliffe came by the station this morning," he said. "Filed a report. Claims you're harboring stolen property." Hazel crossed her arms. "They're living beings, not furniture." Barlow gave a faint nod. "I know, Hazel, but the law doesn't always care about what we feel." Nate's jaw tightened. "Then maybe it should." The sheriff hesitated, then motioned toward the table. "Show me what you've got." Hazel slid the folder forward. Medical scans, photographs, temperature readings, notes detailing trauma inconsistent with environmental exposure. Barlow flipped through them slowly, his expression darkening. "Damn it," he muttered. "That's not all," Nate said. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a memory card. Traffic cam from Route 9 caught a black SUV stopping near the estate 2 nights before the storm. Same model Wycliffe drives. Barlow stiffened. "You got footage? Enough to raise questions." The sheriff rubbed his jaw, conflicted. "You know how this goes. Wycliffe has lawyers, friends in the county. This won't be easy." Before Nate could answer, Freya let out a low, broken whine. They turned just in time to see her body tense. Her breathing quickened, and she tried to stand, then collapsed with a sharp cry. Ghost whimpered, scrambling closer. Hazel was at her side instantly. "She's in pain," she said, fingers moving with practiced speed. "Internal scar tissue, old damage, it's flaring." Barlow knelt beside them, his expression changing from professional concern to something closer to anger. "This isn't coincidence," Hazel said firmly. "This dog has been abused over time, repeatedly." Freya's body shuddered as another wave passed through her. Nate knelt beside her, resting a hand against her neck, his voice low and steady. "You're safe," he murmured. "I've got you." Her eyes met his, clouded with pain, but trusting. As Hazel administered medication, Coda suddenly lifted his head and growled, not at the door, but at the folder on the table. He stepped forward, nose hovering over the papers, then moved to the photograph of the SUV. His hackles rose, a deep warning rumbling from his chest. Barlow stared. "That dog, he's reacting like he recognizes something." Nate felt the air shift again. "He does," he said quietly, "and that means this isn't over." Barlow straightened slowly. The hesitation drained from his face. "All right," he said, "I've seen enough." He stood, pulling his hat back on. "I can't promise how fast this will move, but I can promise you this. I'm opening an investigation." Hazel let out a breath she'd been holding. "And the dogs?" Nate asked. "They stay here," Barlow replied, "under your protection, officially." Relief hit Nate harder than he expected. Not victory, just the absence of dread. The sheriff paused at the door. "One more thing. Wycliffe won't like this. He's not used to being told no." Nate met his gaze. "Neither am I." After Barlow left, the cabin fell quiet again. Hazel packed her bag, pausing before she went. "You're doing the right thing," she said, "even if it costs you." Nate looked down at Freya, now resting more easily, Ghost pressed close. "I already paid the cost once," he said. "This time, I'm choosing what it buys." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying snow across the clearing. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. And somewhere beyond the trees, a man who thought he owned everything had just been challenged for the first time. The warning came without sound. Nate noticed it first in the way the cabin shifted. Freya's breathing changing, shallow becoming sharp, her body going rigid, as if something ancient had been struck inside her. The fire crackled low, shadows stretching long across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind rose again, not sudden, but deliberate, like a door being opened somewhere far away. Freya stood abruptly. Ghost whimpered, startled, his small white body scrambling to keep contact with her. Coda lifted his head at the same instant, ears snapping forward, muscles coiling tight. He didn't growl this time. He didn't need to. Freya bolted. The door wasn't fully latched. Nate had been in and out all evening reinforcing shutters as the second storm warning came over the radio. Freya slammed her weight into it, wood creaking, then snow and night swallowed her whole. Ghost slipped from Nate's reach in a flash of white fur, following her without hesitation. "No!" Nate lunged, boots skidding on the floor, but the door was already swinging wide, wind tearing it from his hands. By the time he reached the porch, Freya and Ghost were gone. The storm hit like a wall. Snow lashed sideways, thick and blinding, the kind that erased direction and sound. The world narrowed to breath and instinct. Nate didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope coiled by the door, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped into the white. "Coda," he said sharply. The German shepherd was already moving. Coda plunged into the snow, nose low, tail rigid, body cutting a path with brutal efficiency. He was 5 years old, built heavy and powerful, his black and tan coat already crusting with ice. This wasn't panic, this was work. His gait shifted into something precise, practiced, head angled, breath measured, tracking through chaos. Nate followed, heart pounding, lungs burning with cold air. Every step took effort. Every second mattered. Freya's trail was faint. Scratches, broken drifts, drops of blood darkening the snow. Nate's chest tightened at the sight. She was injured. Badly. They moved downhill, toward the ravine. Nate knew the place. Everyone in town did. A narrow cut through the mountainside, steep and unstable, where snow gathered deep and ice hid beneath it. He had avoided it instinctively since returning home. Freya hadn't. The wind screamed as they reached the edge. Visibility dropped to nothing. Nate dropped to his knees, anchoring himself with the rope, peering into the void below. Then he heard it. A sound, thin as thread. A whimper. Coda barked once, short, sharp, and pulled hard on the line, muscles straining, eyes locked downward. They were there. Freya lay wedged against the ravine wall 20 feet below, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, blood streaking her hind leg. Ghost was pinned beneath her chest, alive only because she had made herself a shield. Her sides heaved, breath ragged but determined. Nate's hand shook, not from cold. "I see you," he shouted, voice torn apart by wind. "I'm coming." He tied off the rope to a stunted pine, tested the knot with practiced force, then began the descent. Snow gave way under his boots, ice slicing through his gloves. Pain flared as he slipped once, rope snapping taut against his weight, shoulder screaming. He ignored it. Freya lifted her head weakly when he reached her, eyes glassy but focused. She didn't try to move, didn't whine. She just held Ghost tighter. "You did good," Nate said, kneeling, pressing his forehead briefly to hers. "You did exactly right." He wrapped Ghost first, tucking the puppy inside his jacket, feeling the faint flutter of a heartbeat against his chest. Then Freya, heavy, trembling, every breath a battle. She tried to stand and failed. Nate swore softly and shifted his weight, looping the rope beneath her chest, bracing her body against his own. The climb back was agony. Snow poured down with every movement. Nate's arms burned, shoulder screaming, lungs on fire. Twice he nearly lost his footing. Through it all, Coda stayed above. Paws dug in, weight pulling back on the rope with him, growling low each time the line slipped. Halfway up, Nate felt the rope jerk violently. Not from his movement, but from above. For a split second, panic flared. Then a voice cut through the storm. "I've got the line. Hold on!" Flashlights pierced the snow. Sheriff Barlow's silhouette appeared at the edge, flanked by 2 deputies. They hauled together, muscles and will aligned, dragging Nate, Freya, and Ghost back onto solid ground. Freya collapsed the moment they cleared the edge, her body finally giving in. Ghost whimpered weakly, nose buried against her neck. Hazel was there too, kneeling instantly, hands steady despite the wind. She worked fast, bandaging, checking breath, murmuring reassurance that sounded more like prayer. "You were minutes away," she told Nate quietly. He nodded, unable to speak. Blue lights flashed through the snow as Elliot Wycliffe's SUV was stopped down the road, deputies surrounding it. Inside the cabin of the vehicle, Elliot sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes burning with fury. Not fear. Not yet. By the time Freya was stabilized and Ghost secured, the storm began to ease, as if it had taken what it came for and decided to let the rest live. Sheriff Barlow approached Nate, snow clinging to his coat, expression grim but resolved. "We've got enough," he said. "Medical reports, witness statements. Tonight sealed it. Wycliffe's under formal investigation. Animal cruelty. Neglect. Endangerment." Nate looked down at Freya, now breathing more evenly, her body still pressed protectively around Ghost, even in exhaustion. "She ran," Barlow added quietly. "Not because she was afraid, because she was protecting him." Nate swallowed hard. That's what soldiers do. Coda sat beside him, snow frosting his muzzle, amber eyes steady. He leaned just enough for Nate's hand to rest against his neck. For the first time since the storm began, the night fell silent. Not empty. Finished. The snow did not vanish all at once. It retreated the way grief does, slowly, unevenly, leaving behind patches of silence and damp earth that felt strange after so much white. Morning light filtered through the pines above Nate Kincaid's cabin, pale and tentative, as if unsure whether it was welcome yet. He stood on the porch with a mug of coffee he had forgotten to drink, watching breath rise from the ground, where winter had loosened its grip. His shoulders were still sore from the rescue. His hands bore thin cuts that stung when the wind touched them, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Inside, the cabin was no longer quiet in the way it used to be. Freya lay near the hearth, her massive frame relaxed but alert, amber eyes tracking every sound. The wound along her side had been stitched cleanly, wrapped carefully by Hazel the night of the rescue. She moved slowly now, deliberately, as if relearning trust with every step. Ghost slept against her belly, white fur bright against the dark wood floor, his tiny ribs rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Coda sat near the open door, ears high, posture disciplined, even at rest. 5 years old, thick-chested and powerful, his black and tan coat bore the marks of long training, scarred here and there, fur worn thin at the joints. He watched the tree line as if the world might ask something of him again at any moment. Nate had once lived for that feeling. Now he breathed through it. The legal process moved slower than storms. Papers arrived. Calls were made. Sheriff Barlow came by twice with updates, his tone shifting from cautious professionalism to something almost apologetic. Elliot Wycliffe had lawyered up, of course. Men like him always did. But the evidence was too clean, the injuries too specific, the witnesses too many. And Freya's scars spoke louder than any courtroom argument. Hazel visited often, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to check in. She wore the same practical clothes every time, dark jeans, sturdy boots, hair tied back tight, but her eyes softened more with each visit. She never asked Nate why he stayed. She seemed to understand. "You're not running any more," she said once, as she watched him change Freya's bandage. "No," Nate replied. "I'm learning how to stop." That afternoon, a truck pulled into the drive that Nate didn't recognize. It was old, dust-streaked, the kind that had seen more winters than comfort. A woman stepped out, hesitating before approaching the porch. She was in her early 30s, tall and thin, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a loose braid that slipped over one shoulder. Her skin was pale from long winters, eyes a muted green that held both caution and exhaustion. She wore a faded parka and gloves too thin for the weather. "My name's Sarah Colby," she said quietly. "Sheriff Barlow said I could find you here." Her voice carried the strain of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Nate nodded. "What can I do for you?" She swallowed. "I heard you help dogs, working dogs, ones that don't fit anywhere else." Nate didn't answer immediately. He waited. "People told the truth when you gave them silence. I used to train search dogs," she continued, "before my husband died. After that, I couldn't keep the place running. They took most of them. But one," her voice caught, "one of them's still out there. They say he's aggressive now, unadoptable." Her hands trembled as she pulled a folded photo from her coat. A lean shepherd mix stared back, eyes bright but wary, a scar cutting through one ear. "They're going to put him down next week," she whispered. Behind Nate, Coda shifted. A low sound escaped his throat, not a growl, not a bark. Recognition. Nate felt it then, that quiet pressure in his chest, the same one he'd felt the night Freya ran into the storm. Coda stepped forward and gently took the photograph from Sarah's trembling hand, holding it between his teeth before laying it carefully at Nate's feet. The moment hung there, fragile and impossible to ignore. Nate exhaled slowly. "You should stay for coffee." Sarah looked up, startled. What?" "Storm's coming again," he said, glancing at the horizon. "And you look like you've been carrying something heavy for too long." She hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the cabin felt different than it once had. Lived in. Warm. The kettle sang softly on the stove. Ghost stirred and toddled clumsily across the floor, tripping over his own paws. Freya watched him with patient eyes, her tail thumping once when he reached her. Sarah knelt, careful, letting Ghost sniff her fingers. Tears slipped down her face without warning. "I thought I lost everything," she said, "but seeing them, I don't know. It feels like maybe some things are just waiting." Nate leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "That's how it starts." The weeks that followed came quietly. No headlines, no ceremonies, just work. Nate cleared the old shed behind the cabin, reinforcing the walls, adding heat lamps, building runs from reclaimed timber. Hazel brought medical supplies. Barlow looked the other way when he needed to. Sarah came back, then stayed. They called it Northridge Haven. No sign, no donations, just word of mouth. Dogs arrived in ones and twos. A retired bomb dog with failing hips. A shepherd who flinched at raised hands. A Malamute who howled all night until Freya pressed her side against the fence and slept beside him. Nate found his rhythm in it. Not command, not control. Presence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the forest glowed gold, Nate sat on the porch steps. Coda rested his head on Nate's knee. Freya lay stretched out nearby, eyes closed in the warmth. Ghost tumbled clumsily through the grass, chasing nothing at all. The wind moved through the trees like a breath let out after holding too long. Nate closed his eyes. For the first time in years, nothing inside him was running. And when he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Not this time," he said. "No one gets left behind." In the end, the miracle was not thunder from the sky or a voice in the wind. It was a door that opened in the cold, a hand that chose mercy, and a life that refused to leave another life behind. Sometimes God does not remove the storm. He places a small flame in someone's chest and says, "Carry this." And that is how grace walks into ordinary days, into your kitchen light before sunrise, into the quiet decision to forgive, into the moment you stop scrolling and choose to help, to call, to check on someone who has been too silent for too long. If this story reminded you that love can still show up on the worst road home, share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what small miracle has found you in your everyday life. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of loyalty, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, steady your heart, and guide you toward the kind of kindness that changes everything.